Hello friends, I am Dr. Anbarasi, Professor of Physiology from Chettinad Hospital and Research Institute. I am very happy to be a part of this module on pulmonary function test. In this session, I am going to take you all through the basics of mechanics of respiration. Here we are going to discuss about the muscles involved in breathing and the movements brought about by the muscles, predominantly the bucket handle movement and the pump handle movement. The pressure changes that are happening during inspiration and expiration. Certain important concepts like compliance and elastance of the lungs, the role of alveolar surface tension and the surfactant, and finally we are going to discuss about the work of breathing. Probably we will discuss these topics in two sections. First we will see about the muscles of respiration. Respiration includes inspiration as well as expiration. Inspiration is an active process. It is brought about by the very important muscle, that is diaphragm. The diaphragm brings about almost 80% of the inspiration, which when contracts, it pulls down the thoracic cavity so that the vertical diameter increases. The other important muscle that helps in inspiration is the external intercostal muscles, which when contract increases the anteroposterior diameter as well as the lateral diameter of the thoracic cavity. These two muscles are normally involved during resting conditions, but sometimes when we need to breathe heavily like in exercise, these accessory muscles also will come into play. Sternocleidomastoid, serratus anterior and scalene are the accessory muscles that are helpful for inspiration. On the contrary, the expiration is a passive process. It is a passive process chiefly brought about by the elastic recoil of all the structures that have been expanded during inspiration. In addition to that, if needed, the internal intercostal muscle will also come into play. But whenever there is a need for more expiration, these muscles, these accessory muscles, abdominal muscles will also come into play, which includes external oblique, internal oblique, rectus abdominis and transverse abdominis muscle. Coming to the movements of the chest, during inspiration, there is increase in the size of the thoracic cavity, which is brought about chiefly by the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Because of these muscles, there is increase in the vertical diameter, anteroposterior diameter and the lateral diameter. Okay. So, this increase in the thoracic cavity size causes a drop in the intrathoracic pressure so that the air rushes from the atmosphere into the lungs. What happens during expiration? Here the opposite happens. There is decrease in the size of the thoracic cavity with all its diameters gets decreasing, and there will be increase in the pressure in the lungs, so which pushes the air outside to the atmosphere. So, the chief movements of the respiration includes the vertical movement of the diaphragm, which increases the vertical diameter, the pump handle movement and the bucket handle movement. First we will see about the pump handle movement. Here the thoracic cavity and its structures are compared with that of a water pump. Okay. We have seen water pump and this is how it looks like. The sternum is almost similar to the tip of the water pump. The ribs are compared with that of the handle of the water pump, and the base of the water pump is the spinal cord, that is your vertebra. Okay. So, what happens when the external intercostal muscles of the upper ribs they contract, the sternum is pushed outwards and away from the thoracic cavity. Okay. So, this causes increase in the anteroposterior diameter. It is pulled upwards like this, like how we move the pump handle upwards. Okay. So, there occurs increase in the anteroposterior diameter, and that helps in increase in the size of the thoracic cavity. Next is the bucket handle movement. Here the ribs are similar to the handle of the bucket. Okay. So, this is the vertebral column, this is the sternum, and the ribs are connected to the sternum and the vertebral column. It is almost compared with that of the handle of the bucket. Okay. So, what will happen when you lift the handle of the bucket when it is filled with water? The bucket increases in its lateral diameter like this. Similar thing happens when the external intercostal muscles of the lower ribs contracts, the ribs are pulled outwards like this, and there occurs increase in the lateral diameter, that is transverse diameter of the thoracic cavity, similar to the increase in the inlet of the bucket diameter. Okay. So, this is called as bucket handle movement, which results in increase in the transverse diameter. The next section we will see about the pressure changes in the respiratory system. So, before that we will see what are all the pressures prevailing in the thoracic cavity. First we will see about what are all the structures in the thoracic cavity. The outermost is the chest wall, which is made up of the muscles, the external and the intercostal muscles, and the ribs in between. Okay. And you can see the chief muscle here is the diaphragm, which increases the vertical diameter. Okay. Now, this is the lungs. The lungs, they are freely floating in the thoracic cavity, except at one place at the hilum where it is attached. Okay. Otherwise, it is freely floating in the thoracic cavity. The lungs is covered by a layer called as pleura. The one which is present next to the lung surface is the visceral pleura. So, this is the visceral pleura. Okay. And the one which is lying little outer near the thoracic wall is the parietal pleura. Okay. So, this is the parietal pleura. Okay. And if you can see here, there is a potential space here in between the two pleural layer, and this is called as pleural cavity. Okay. So, this pleural cavity is very small. It is not like this, which I have shown in the diagram. For understanding sake, I have drawn it bigger, but it is actually a very negligible space, and there is a very negligible fluid present in between these two layers, and that is called as pleural fluid. Okay. It is the presence of this pleural fluid that the lungs are not just rubbing each other, causing to friction and inflammation. It is freely sliding over each other. Okay. So, for example, if we take these two glass slides, this is the visceral pleura, this is the parietal pleura, let us assume so. These slides are very dry in nature, so these won't stick together. Okay. If you just attach each other, it is not sticking, it is easily separable. But when it moves on each other, you can see the friction is happening. I think you can hear the sounds also. Okay. But what happens when you have a drop of water on this glass slide? Okay. Now, we will place a drop of water on this glass slide, and you just see now the slide is not separable easily. They get adhered to each other. Okay. And you can see when you move this slides over each other, there is no sound. Okay, there is no friction. This minimizes the inflammation and the friction, because the lungs keeps on getting inflated, deflated. Along with that, along with the lung, the visceral pleura also gets inflated and deflated. The parietal pleura also moves along with the lungs and the chest wall, but without any friction. That is the wonder of this pleural fluid. Okay. So, this is the pleural fluid compartment, and next to the pleural fluid you have got the chest wall, which is made up of the muscles and the rib cage. Okay. Now, there are three pressures acting in this respiratory system. Okay. The pressure 1, or we mention it as A. Now, this pressure is the pressure that is seen in the alveoli, or we can simply say this is the pressure which is present in the lungs. Okay. So, for example, if you see this bronchi, they get divided into bronchioles, smaller bronchioles, and they finally end up in the alveoli. So, this is the pressure, the pulmonary pressure, which is representing the pressure inside the alveoli as well as the lung parenchyma. So, we mark it as A is nothing but intrapulmonary pressure, intrapulmonary pressure or intraalveolar pressure. Okay, we refer it as P pulmonary. Okay. So, this intrapulmonary pressure is found to be 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, fine. Okay. Then there is another pressure inside the respiratory system, which we mark it as B. This is actually intrapleural pressure, because this is the pressure present in the pleural cavity. Okay. So, B is nothing but intrapleural pressure. We mention it as PIP. So, this PIP is little lesser than the intrapulmonary pressure. It is around 756 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So, this is little lesser. Okay. Now, we will discuss what are the factors that has produced this lesser intrapleural pressure little later. Okay. There is another pressure which is acting on the chest wall, that is C, which is actually the barometric pressure or atmospheric pressure. Okay. Atmospheric pressure, we call it as P atmosphere, which is, we know very well, it is 760 millimeters mercury. Okay. Now, we can also refer these pressures with respect to the atmospheric pressure. We always refer the pressures with respect to the atmospheric pressure. So, in that way, we can very well write these pressures in a different way, like intrapulmonary pressure with respect to the atmospheric pressure, we can write it as A minus C, which is 760 minus 760, we refer it as 0 millimeters of mercury. Got it? Okay. Similarly, intrapleural pressure, we can refer with respect to the atmospheric pressure, we can refer it as B minus C, which is 756 minus 760, which comes to around minus 4 millimeters of mercury. Remember, it is negative. The intrapleural pressure is negative normally. Okay. And barometric pressure, we know it is 760. Now, why this intrapleural pressure is negative? This is because of certain forces that is acting on this pleural cavity. Okay. So, if you can see here, the visceral pleura is clinging to the surface of the lungs. The lungs always tends to collapse. Okay. So, the elastic recoil tendency of the lungs is to collapse. Okay. So, this lungs, when it collapses, it also pulls the visceral pleura along with it. Next is the parietal pleura. This parietal pleura, it tends to get adhered to the chest wall. So, the tendency of the chest wall is always to pop outwards. So, what happens when the chest wall is recoiling, it recoils outwards. So, the parietal pleura is pushed outwards. Remember, the visceral pleura is pushed inwards, whereas the parietal pleura is pushed outwards. So, this creates an increase in this cavity space. So, this cavity, pleural cavity, when it increases in its volume, the pressure automatically drops. Remember the Boyle's law? Okay. What is Boyle's law stating? When the pressure increases, the volume decreases and vice versa. Okay. So, this decreases the pressure, that is how it becomes negative here. Got it? So, this is the intrapleural pressure. Not only this absolute pressures like intraalveolar or intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure exist, we need to understand the two important gradients of the pressure. So, one is this difference between the intrapulmonary and the intrapleural pressures. Okay. So, this is the intrapulmonary and the intrapleural pressure, which is nothing but A minus B. Okay. So, this A minus B is called as transpulmonary pressure. Okay. So, TP. So, which comes around 760 minus 756, which is actually plus 4 millimeter mercury. Okay. So, this transpulmonary pressure is exactly the elastic recoil of the lungs. Okay. So, this is very important to understand. The another gradient or another important pressure is the difference between these two compartments, that is intrapleural pressure and the atmospheric pressure, okay, which is nothing but B minus C. Let me write it here. So, this pressure is actually B minus C. Okay. So, this B minus C is nothing but transthoracic pressure. Okay. So, the transthoracic pressure will come to around 756 minus 760, which is actually minus 4 millimeters of mercury, which is actually the intrapleural pressure. So, the transthoracic pressure which is acting across the chest wall is actually the intrapleural pressure. If you record the transthoracic pressure anywhere in the thoracic cavity, it will be the same. It will be the same in the esophagus, it will be same in the mediastinum, okay? It will be same in the pleural cavity as well. So, these two pressures are very important. And one more thing is, the transthoracic pressure is not the same everywhere, okay? So, in the base of the lung it is different, okay? In the middle of the lung it is different, in the apex also it is different. This is because of the effect of gravity, okay? So, in the base of the lung what happens? This pleural cavity space is getting decreased because of the pull of the gravity. This visceral pleura comes close to the parietal pleura. So, what happens? The cavity space decreases, so it becomes less negative. Whereas, in the apex what happens when a person is standing, this parietal pleura and the visceral pleura are farther apart, because the visceral pleura by the effect of gravity is pulled downwards, the space is getting increased, okay. So, because of that the cavity size increases, it becomes more negative. So, these are the factors that affect the pressures in the respiratory system. So, let us discuss about the pressure changes that is happening during inspiration and expiration. We saw that the pressure inside the pleural cavity, or the one which is representing the pressure of the thoracic cavity, is this intrathoracic pressure or intrapleural pressure, okay, and it is always subatmospheric in nature. At the beginning of inspiration, with the pleural pressure, which is usually it is negative, minus 2.5 millimeters of mercury. Now, it becomes more negative at the end of inspiration to minus 6 millimeters of the mercury. In terms of centimeters of water, it changes from minus 5 to minus 7.5 centimeters of water. So, with this increasing negativity of the pleural pressure, the lung volume increases to around 0.5 liters. That means, with each breath when we take in, the pressure goes more negative. With that, there is an increase or rushing of air of about 0.5 liters. This is actually the tidal volume, okay. As we discussed before, the effect of posture and the gravity is significant over this intrapleural pressure. So, in standing posture, because of the effect of the gravity, the apex is having more negative intrapleural pressure when compared to the base of the lungs, the reason we saw in the last slide, okay. The clinical significance of this intrapleural pressure is, whenever there is an accumulation of the air or water, as in the case of pneumothorax or hydropneumothorax, there occurs collapse of the lung. That means, the pressure, the negative pressure inside the pleural cavity is breached, so that it pushes the lungs to collapse, okay. Next is the intra-alveolar pressure or intrapulmonary pressure, or simply alveolar pressure, which is present inside the alveoli. This also, normally it is 0 millimeters of mercury with respect to the barometric pressure. It decreases, that is, it becomes negative to minus 1 millimeters of mercury during inspiration, and during expiration it goes positive, okay. This transpulmonary pressure is the difference between the alveolar pressure and the pleural pressure. This is the measure of the elastic recoil tendency of the lungs, also called as recoil pressure, okay. So, this is the graph that is shown representing the pressure and the volume during the different phases of respiration. So, what happens during inspiration? The lowermost graph is representing the pleural pressure, okay. So, if you can see here, this is given in centimeters of water. The pressure changes from minus 5 at the end of expiration. So, during inspiration it gradually goes deeper and it becomes minus 7.5 at the end of inspiration. After that, expiration starts and the pressure, pleural pressure increases, and it goes back to its original position, that is minus 5. Okay. Similarly, the alveolar pressure normally at the end of expiration, what happens? It is 0. Okay. So, during inspiration it goes to -1 and during expiration it goes to +1. The difference between these two is called as the transpulmonary pressure. Okay. So, this represents the elastic recoil tendency of the lungs. So, correspondingly, if you see, as the inspiration, as the pressure changes to more negative, there is increment in the air, that is, air is entering into the lungs to around 0.5 liters, and during expiration, when the pressure becomes less negative, the air rushes out of the lung and it becomes it loses its 0.5 liters during expiration. This is called as tidal volume. The respiratory centers actually initiate the stimuli for inspiration, and these impulses are carried via the nerves. Phrenic nerve carries the impulses to the diaphragm, intercostal nerves carries the impulses to the external intercostal muscles. Okay. So, which causes the muscles, diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles to contract, and that causes increase in the cavity size of the thorax. Okay. And because of that, the intrapleural pressure becomes negative, the intra-alveolar pressure also becomes subatmospheric. So, the air from the atmosphere rushes into the lungs. On the contrary, during expiration, opposite thing happens. Okay. So, here the respiratory centers stop sending the impulses. So, the muscles undergo relaxation, the thoracic cavity size becomes decreased. This causes decrease in the intrapleural pressure and the intra-alveolar pressure, they become less negative. So, the alveoli undergo elastic recoiling and air from the lungs, they rush out of the lungs into the atmosphere. This causes deflation of the lungs. In the next section, we will see about the two other important concepts of mechanics, the compliance and the surface tension. In this section, we will see about compliance and elastance. What is this compliance and elastance?